So I think, as you can see here, when we say we have our AP leadership group, we quite literally have our AP leadership group. And what I want everyone watching this to know is this group meets fortnightly. And we meet fortnightly because for us, it's critical that we're constantly looking at best practices, ultimately to serve our players across player safety, performance, and welfare. And so while we most certainly have competitors on this call, we consider ourselves a community of competitors, and very much so in the spirit of how we operate is how we're going to be sharing this open discussion today around key questions that you've put through. And so with that, let's crack into our very first question. And again, we'll go around the room, just a brief answer from everybody. What have been the biggest learnings that you'll bring forward into a post-COVID world? Even though we don't know when that post world is going to begin, what have been those key learnings? So again, Dave, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think coming out of the lockdown that we had here in Ireland was the number of opportunities that exist to improve, no matter what the situation is. And probably the highlight that for me was how good a shape an athlete can come in to a program after being locked in their house for 3 months versus how good a shape an athlete comes in after being locked in Ibiza for 2 months. So yeah, the amount of training that got done, the opportunity that exists there, I think that really bodes well from a performance perspective for everyone. Bit of rest, bit of good training, come back better.
Awesome, thank you, Dave. Charlie.
Yeah, for me and our staff, definitely the work-life balance in terms of not being 24/7 at work. COVID was a good opportunity to spend time with the family and work out that you can work from home. So I'm talking from home today, and just making sure that you're in touch with your staff and just making sure that it's not just always about work, and make sure their mental health side of things is going well.
Awesome, thank you, Charlie. Denis.
Yeah, I think for us it was like a rigorous deconstruction of our program and getting an opportunity to realize what we felt really mattered in our program, and not what didn't matter, but what the big rocks were and how much attention we were paying to it. Right, when we had these limitations, we had serious discussions. All right, when we come out of this, what do we need to get done if we're going to be a better team? And sometimes when you're stuck in the flow of the season, having those conversations with an opportunity to authentically address what matters most can become difficult. So like Charlie said, work-life balance, or if it's strength or content, whatever it is, just making sure we have those really hard conversations around what matters most, I think is one of the key things that happened for us and that we'll take forward.
Awesome, Denis. Tom.
Yeah, I think following on from Denis and Charlie there, we've probably been given a window into our staff members' lives and our players' lives. Realization that everyone's got their own thing going on in addition to the load we put them under at work as well. And I think just kind of personally is when we're reflecting on the program that busyness stifles clarity and it stifles creativity. And I think having that opportunity to really see how creative and clear you can be with what you want the outcome of the program to be when you've got less noise going on around you is somewhere that you need to put yourself in that position more often.
Absolutely, absolutely. Orla.
Yeah, I think similar to Tom, like we had to come back to simplicity because there wasn't much that we could work with. So we took a lot of learnings around what we can do with the girls in remote environments, because a lot of the times in our program they train remotely anyway. So it's kind of giving them that confidence that even though they didn't have access to everything, they could still work on their athletic performance, which was great. And I think as well, we worked a little bit on keeping them connected. So like the girls that we have, they're a social bunch. So keeping them connected with Zoom and whatnot, like that worked too. So just gave us an idea that that's an important part of the program too.
Yeah, most certainly. Allan.
Yeah, for us, I think pretty much saying what everyone's saying through here from an adaptability point of view. You've got to adapt at home. Some people have got dumbbells, some people have only got body weights to train with. So that adaptability while they've been away, and then similarly when they've come back in, some people, as David was saying, have been in Ibiza for a few weeks and haven't been able to get much training done, so they're coming back in different shape. So that adaptability is massive and on an individual basis. And then for us as a group, as staff and as players, to realize how much we miss that competitiveness. You know, being stuck at home and doing homeschooling, we miss that competitiveness. So to bring that back into training and get people competing against each other was massive for us. Again, getting back in.
Yeah, 100%. Ed.
Yeah, very similar. As Tom said, the idea of having talks with players and conversations with players, not about rugby, but actually about them and their life and finding out what's going on with them was huge. And then from a programming perspective, it was a challenge. We had players with a lot of different levels of access to equipment. So a lot of isometric work and single leg work and plyos that hopefully will influence my programming going forward. And then as TJ said, just that appreciation for getting back on field, and even if there's no S&C, just being able to watch a rugby session and watch the boys train is a highlight.
100%. Now, Ed, maybe to pick up on that point back to you or for anyone else, because you highlighted there, are there any S&C specific strategies? You mentioned isometrics that you've now, out of circumstance, said, wow, that worked a lot better than I thought it might, or I never considered that you will now bring forward. Maybe get into a touch of specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, we, especially in a sevens environment where we've such a huge requirement on running, it's always a balancing act with us to how much load we put through the lads in the gym, because we never want to negatively affect our pitch sessions. They're always our priority. So through use of a lot of kind of isometric work and single leg work that maybe is not as taxing on the players, and that's something we'll take forward a lot into our sessions. We try and get 3 or 4 gym sessions a week into the boys. So it's about getting that load through them, but knowing that they're fresh and ready to go the next day. So a lot of that isometric work luckily leaves them kind of less fatigued and less sore the next day. So that and probably a lot of work around bulletproofing our shoulders, our groins, our calves. They were things we were able to get done at home, and hopefully we'll keep them forward as well.
Going forward. Anybody else in there, and Andy, I still want to come to you, but anyone else in there have any targeted specific strategies, whether they be running based, conditioning, S&C based, that you like, yeah, we're going to highlight that and bring it forward?
I think from our end, Nick, the way COVID sort of unfolded, you tended to start with a basic running plan. I'm assuming everyone probably went down that MAS straight line running direction initially, and we got to a point where we were probably starting to reinvent the wheel and just kept doing the same thing. So we changed the focus of our conditioning to probably what everyone's doing now, but a multi-focus session. So, which would have components of straight line, have components of out and back, have components of ground contact, have components of speed exposure, as opposed to just the template of what we tend to give guys in regeneration weeks.
Yeah, awesome. Great. And Andy, obviously you come at this a little bit different. You're normally working with data and behind a computer, so you might have been less directly affected, but giving everyone an indication that you are kind of the person behind the info flow and the numbers. Any key learnings that you might want to share with everyone from a COVID perspective?
I mean, the thing that really sticks out for me, and it's been touched on by Allan and others, is the adaptability. Just how quickly we went from, particularly at the start, we went from, business as usual to suddenly having these restrictions, and then, how quickly everyone adapted to that. But also, that there was that period in July when restrictions started to relax a lot quicker than we all expected, and a certain amount of work had obviously got into looking at what pre-season looked like. And then it sort of changed quite rapidly, and obviously, now of course it looks like it's going the other way. But I think it highlights that the way we did things in the past, or even the way that we do things now, isn't set in stone. It can change. Obviously in this case it's been forced from an outside event, but I think it's a useful message about the way things have been done doesn't need to be the way things are done in the future.
100%. And if I can put in my 2 cents there, I think out of this circumstance, we had to formalize a lot of discussion, a lot of communication that normally would be organic. And I think there's 2 things that I've observed in there. One, it reminded me how important the organic conversation is. To be able just to step over, 10 feet into another office and have a quick chat to find out a piece of information. Whereas in the present circumstance, it has to be so formalized. So maybe call that the benefit of the former way. At the same time, by really examining when we need to speak with individuals, when we need to protect time to have discussion. We have had probably early on too many discussions, but those then started to curtail themselves down to the right frequency. And even this group was not meeting fortnightly pre-COVID. But one thing I think we've all said is moving forward, even once this has all remedied itself, just the value of this group continuing to communicate is critical. And so examining communication as a practice and how this maybe taught us about its importance and how to get more out of it. Even the use of virtual as necessary is there to keep those conversations going, because ultimately that's where things get dropped, when two people think that one thing needs to be happening, but they're not on the same page. And so I think communication for me has been highlighted tremendously in this time. So beautiful opening. Let's now move into our first specific question. And Dave Howarth, this one's coming at you. We've been talking about contact prep quite a bit in our preparation for COVID, but obviously contact prep is always a critical thing to be considering when they're coming off the beach at Ibiza, right? Whatever it is, it's important. So question as follows: considering the COVID scenario specifically and contact preparation generally, what activities should we have players do to prepare for contact? And are there any specific neck-related exercises you would recommend? So we'll start with Dave, and then anyone else might have some input.
Yeah, I think to get to the end point, to get to that point of contact, you got to sort of lay out your beliefs around that. So one of my key beliefs with contact and specifically contact injuries is that if you don't practice it, you're going to heighten your risk. So it's not about, lowering the level of contact per se, not lowering your expectations around contact, and, definitely not avoiding it. That's probably the first thing to say. In terms of a contact progression, for us, the way that we approach this is looking at, I guess, the positional requirements of that. So what position does your body have to be in? What's the timing of that contact like? How are you going to go and get in the best position possible to win a collision, whether you be carrying or tackling, whatever it might be? So we look at some of those positional, actual physical, personal position requirements and start training some of those. Putting yourself in a position where you're having to drop late, practicing that drop late so you can have an effective tackle and still be able to move your feet. Doing some basic footwork, some shadow footwork with someone. One of the real interesting ones that we got was one of our players has, a few of our players have dogs, and just doing shadow drills with their dogs and throwing balls and having to stay in between the ball and the dog. One of them got a little bit aggressive one weekend, and there may have been a couple of stitches. But it's just those sorts of things. Any type of drill that you can get to get your footwork, dropping late, where we did have guys partnered up. So to be specific to this scenario, where they were sharing a household, we had those guys start their contact prep a little bit earlier. Little things like making sure they have some sort of weighted bag, whether it be a tackle bag or some sort of heavy bag, bending over and working on jackal positions, challenging people in those bent over sort of compromised positions. Those were the sorts of things we looked at. Once we did get back into contact and where we could start doing drills to move us towards our endpoint, much closer to our endpoint, we started with three key things in mind. The first thing was velocity of the contact, so how much speed was coming into it. The second thing was the activity of that contact, so how much the attacker or the defender was fighting through the point of contact. And then the last thing was the context of it, so how many bodies do we have in play, and how much competitiveness is there in that, and building through some pretty logical progressions there. So number one, using suits or pads, start your contact progression there, and then building further and further away from that. So we start with pads, then we go to suits, then we go to bone on bone. The second thing would be, like I said, the velocity of it. So starting in short range, maybe from a knee, building up to standing into, 1 or 2 meters apart to, like 5, 10, 15 full context apart. And then the active or the passive opposition player. So if someone's carrying at you, you're going in a tackling drill, does that person give up as soon as the contact hits, or do they try and fight through it? What equipment do they have there? Are they using a pad or are they using their shoulder? Can certainly bring some context. But then from there, once you attain that certain level of contact, to continue that on, to keep doing a certain amount of that each and every week, so that when it does come to game time, you're not in a position that you haven't been in before. The timing is there. You're not putting your hand somewhere stupid or your head somewhere stupid and risking a concussion or a broken hand. And that's what we were seeing with guys who'd been a long time off of contact. The injuries that they got were these, quote unquote, unavoidable contact injuries. But the guys who did a longer contact prep, who built up more gradually, had better timing, they didn't seem to get as many of those. And it doesn't matter what your sport is. You could be talking about anything here. If you're in basketball and you're flying for a closeout, someone clips your feet. Well, if you've never practiced flying out for a closeout, you're probably not going to be very good at it. So that same ideal applies all the way through, no matter what the contact or the context there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it seems, Dave, just to echo what I'm hearing there, especially if you're in S&C trying to put programming out before you've gotten into any on-pitch contact, it's what are the key body positions my player needs to get into, and how can I build strength, power, robustness in those body positions? That would be a key take-home. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you sort of break down rugby into those key positions, into those key, body positions, those key movements, there's some really big factors in there. I know we'll probably talk about this a little later on, but just being able to decelerate, being able to move your feet, working with some of those patterns, that's a big one. The ability to bend over into a jackal position and have some stress put on you, be twisted, be pulled. Even using weights there to just hop yourself forward. Some of those little movements, those little drills really, really help. We can come back to neck exercises. I know Delo's got his hand up there.
Jump in there.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to highlight what the two of you have said and how important it is, because I think when we're talking about contact, like Dave awesomely put there, contact and impact are two different things, right? And I think when you hear the word contact, what we think we want to prepare people for, or that we're only limited to, is the actual moment of impact that happens and how people will handle that. But to Dave's point, when we're talking about body position, reaction, what follows the impact, how they get up off the ground, especially in rugby where there isn't a break in play. So how they're going to prepare themselves after the actual tackle or hit or whatever it is, to get back into position for the next sequence. That's all part of contact, right? So what we wanted to do and what Dave has done is you have to strip it away and look at all of the phases of the actual event. And the impact piece that people think about the most, that sticks in your mind, that it was the hardest for us to be able to train while we were away, is only one element of the actual contact sequence. And so if you look at it that way, there's a ton of stuff that you can work on to prepare yourself for it. And then, of course, the impact element, like Dave said, with, bodysuits and things like that, that you can only really work on when you get another person there. But if you tick off everything else, then that will come, right? So there's a ton of work that we could have actually gotten done, and a really good program put together for contact that Dave outlined there.
Great. Anything else to add, or any specific comments on neck exercises from anybody?
I think from ours, we focused a lot on isometric, and a lot of this is coming, through experience of our staff, playing the game, and the importance of, how well you're able to maintain your neck and your head position going into or through contact, or, like Dee said there, the impact phase is so minute, but if you get that spacing or timing wrong, it can be catastrophic if you're not careful. So it is just a matter of making sure you're in the right space, and training, your head position as part of all of that is really important too. So we worked a lot on that, making sure that the head remains in a really strong, well-packed position, so it's not going to be twisting or turning in the wrong way when that impact moment does happen, and trying to create stress for that, no matter how you have to do it, whether it be a 2-year-old or whether it be the starting lock for the side, whatever you can do there to get that right, that'll certainly help. We used a lot of band work because we had minimal equipment. So bands, tied onto walls or fences, whatever we could do, sideways walks, forward walks, long hold isometrics for neck and head position. Those are some of the things that we sort of went to with neck work.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Sound advice. Tom, we will move over to you with a question on testing to kick us off. So what tests do you suggest for assessing and programming aerobic and anaerobic energy systems? Again, do you have any preference for MAS, 3015, Bronco, etc., on feet or off feet?
Yeah, there's many you can do, obviously on feet or off feet. I think you've got to start with assessing a couple of factors. Number one, is your test going to affect how you program? So are you going to use, if you want to do a mass test, are you going to use mass grids? Are you going to use shuttles? You'll use a shuttle-based test if you want to calculate your aerobic speed, and then you're going to program from a shuttle point of view. Also, what language do the people speak around you? So what's the experience of the player? And what's the coaches buying as well? What tests are they familiar with? Where do they draw confidence as to what specific position a player may be in or what condition they may be in? So I think that there's no one that's better than the other, because I think it's very contextual. I think you can use all of them to some degree. I think, as Charlie alluded to earlier, when we do these mass type programs, there's probably only so long that you can run those for. And they can be very beneficial, but you've got to be very careful with the team as well. When there's other load going in, I think you've got to be very careful with the volume that you use within that. And I think to that point, then you may want to profile players off feet, because you can top players up, or you can do additional work without much energy cost that'll affect the other things. So for example, we'd be lucky to have watt bikes, and we can use that for profiling with different types of tests. So we could work a sub-max test, a sub-max ramp test, which is a very nice way to test a player. So if you've got a busy day, you can still get the testing done, and it's fairly accurate. It'll give you what you need. If you want to be harder, you can use like a cycling protocol. You can use a UCI test, which is a 4-minute test, a 30-second anaerobic test, and 2 6-second sprints as well, which is very, very nasty. So I won't be recommending that to those that are not experienced, but that would give you a full profile from aerobic to anaerobic peak power within that. And again, you can use that then to kind of bias what conditioning you may want to do. But if you're using rowing machines, again, you can use aerobic based tests. You can look at 4 5-minute blocks. You can take meters per second. You can use that to prescribe interval-based training if you wish. We're probably lucky. We've got GPS as well. We can know what zones we're working within games as well. So, as Charlie alluded to, with the kind of COVID situation with the programming, once you've probably exhausted the tempo-based conditioning and some of the shuttle-based conditioning, then you probably want to be as multi-directional as possible. That's the game. That's what we're preparing for. So we probably want to achieve as much of our conditioning with ball in hand as possible.
Yeah. And so Charlie, maybe jump in there, right? We talk about testing as, sometimes it's a gut check. It's to see, hey, where are we at in our readiness to play the game? Other people talk about using testing very specifically to set up all their conditioning parameters. But also, as Tom alludes to there, we can take a different approach where we simply look at the game, almost like contact. We work back from the game and start to progressively build a conditioning profile, factoring in individual differences towards that endpoint of game ready. So where do you see the balance of testing for testing's sake versus using it for programming?
Testing, I think, sometimes for young S&Cs can be a little bit of job justification. We run a Bronco test. If I want someone to get good at a Bronco test, why wouldn't I just get them to keep running a Bronco test? So I could just get them to keep replicating until they get better. Our sort of philosophy is it's a marker. We use the Bronco test. The reason we implemented the Bronco test was, firstly, it's easy to run. You can do it by yourself. and you can do a lot of people at once. So that was the science behind it. We use it as a marker to say, okay, once we've achieved a certain level of bronco test, we're in a safe position to train at the level we want to train at. And I think for all the young S&Cs that are listening to this or watching this, when you're testing, you've got to be able to communicate it well, because basically what happens if you run out of bronco test and everyone fails? What do you do then? Do you run another one? Or is it a mark in the sand, okay, this is where we're at from a physical standpoint, and do we just push on with training? Because I think, as I said previously, too often, we all get a good bronco test and we're all beating our chests. Does that necessarily mean we're going to be a good rugby team or we're going to train well? So I think you need to know why you're testing and then have a strategy if it goes well or if it doesn't go well, and keep it consistent. Like we've done it for 4 years in a row, so we've got good historical data. If you keep changing the test, how relevant is it?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
As well, sorry, Nick, on that. Yeah. For every moment of time that you're allotting to these tests or to the conditioning post of them, that's time you're taking away from rugby. So you've got to work back. In saying that, as Charlie's saying, with the scalability of the test, if I've got an amateur team, well, then it's a great test, and it's a great way to get a good picture of where the people are at, because I can scale it, I can run it with a stopwatch, with 3 markers and a piece of paper, and away I go. I can get that test done. If I've got more equipment, I may do something like a 30-15, but then I've got to start educating players around how that's going to work, and it'll probably give me similar information. It probably won't change how I program too much. So sometimes I think you've just got to get on with training. As Charlie says, you've got to get on with training.
Yeah, and maybe if I can echo there, it almost appears the narrative that we've had is the more that testing can be training and training testing, the better. I think you bring up a good point. If someone doesn't have GPS and they don't have that ongoing understanding of the load being placed on a player, sure, you could make a best guess, but is that the best way to go? We can talk about that maybe later. But some of these tests do provide a very quick way to provide a conditioning exposure alongside give you a sense of kind of where your squad is at. I think, Charlie, you bring up a great point. What's the narrative around it? Right? Is it embedded within training, or is it a special day to do testing? I think that absolutely plays a key role. So really good advice. Allan, what do you got to add there?
Yeah, from our side, it's also, we've talked about just the sort of the healthy squad side of things, but definitely on the RTP phase. And, Tom's alluded to some of the off-feet tests that can be done on watt bikes and rows. And I think for us, that's a big part of closing the loop on that return to play steps, to keep those players sort of motivated and keen to get going back into the rugby side of things. So from a watt bike test or a simple bronco in that return to play phase, I think is a massive part of the return to play and the testing protocol. So for us, it's a big motivation for those return to play players. Yep.
No, 100%. So let's shift now into a close cousin in the general, large, at times confusing space of monitoring. And we'll start off again with Coach Howarth here. So there seems to be a lot of discussion around, if you would, in quotes, myth of injury prediction and concerns with an overdependence possibly on the acute and the chronic workload. Are we constantly just looking at spikes to drive how we manage a player? So the question is, can you comment on how you approach managing players to, let's say, balance risk, but with the pursuit of performance, knowing that at the end of the day, it's two sides of the same coin?
Yeah. Look, I think whenever we use words like prediction or prevention, they're very absolute. Now you're putting yourself into a space where you're guaranteeing something that, like, quite frankly, you cannot guarantee. A 1.5 acute to chronic workload ratio is not predictive of anything, really, not truly. It may be indicative of a change in your training, but it's not indicative of an impending doom. It's just a number, it's a ratio. So you got to gain a certain comfort with that. I think like everything that's been said so far here today, we work from the game backwards. So our approach is to do exactly that. So what is the demand of a game? What is the demand of a training week, which is going to largely come from your coaches? What is the demand to get ready for that game? How much training time would you typically need? And then set a high bar. Say, okay, well, this is what we want to be able to achieve every week. For us, we use a benchmark. We say, well, of our top 30% of training weeks, so our hardest training weeks and hardest games, the top 30% of our weeks, let's take an average of those and say that's what we want the standard training week to look like. And then plan just a little bit above and below that. Now, all of a sudden, an acute to chronic workload ratio becomes a really handy check-in tool for your periodization of your training. Now you're not looking at it going like, oh, geez, I wonder what injury risk we're going to entail here. It's just looking at whether you want to be above maximal to really push them out there, stress the system, stretch the players, make sure that when they do get to game day, whatever it is they're going to encounter, they've encountered it before, like we said with contact. Like we've said with conditioning, a nice way to top people up or give them an expectation in terms of coming back. We set that benchmark, go above. And then when you've got a really important game or you're in a heavy schedule, set it below, set up below that. And then take your markers from those things. Listen to your players. If you've got GPS or if you've got great heart rate systems and are able to do submaximal tests and things like that to see what their autonomic nervous system response is. If you've got force plates, have a look at the changes in markers. But if you've got a pen and paper, take an RPE, multiply it by the time that you took to train and educate you guys on how to score that. Just say to them, this is the scale. Here's the Borg scale. Here's what a 10 is. It's the hardest thing you've ever done. What's your hardest session ever? And when you put it into that context for someone answering RPE, they start to understand it. Someone goes, oh, it's a 10. Is it really? That's the hardest thing you've ever done. Give them a pause. And they come back to you a little bit later. Actually, that's an 8. Now you start getting these real, more, I guess, meaningful numbers back to you on your workload, and you can track the changes in that over time against what you expected to create. I think that's the really important thing. Injuries are going to come. They're going to happen. It is a contact. It is an impact sport, to Dennis's point. But if you prepare guys or girls for that level of contact and that level of competition, and you expose them to it over time, then all of these things in the background start to become a little less intimidating and a little bit more realistic for you to plan in. All of a sudden your coach says, I want to go bone on bone. You're able to say, well, we've got 20 minutes left in our budget this week, so let's use it wisely.
Yeah. So before we jump to Orla, what I'm hearing is, I know a lot of people watching this are going to be saying, we don't have GPS. So obviously you jump in with the use of RP, duration, get your arbitrary units. But I think you do, humor aside, you do highlight something really important there. You got to know your playing group, and you really got to make sure that their voice and your understanding of their voice is strong in how you're managing and building the program. Because ultimately, they're going to have the best pulse on how they're feeling. We can't summarize everyone just down to a number. And so even though RP and duration gives us a number, and if we use it rigorously, gives us some accurate information, it's the discussion around it that is key. Yeah. Orla.
Sorry, Nick, just to jump in there. I think that's, that is typically, I don't know about the rest of the guys on this call, but typically we'd say like, oh, we got an intern, or the young guy will go and take the RPEs. That's my favorite job. That's my favorite job on training day, because it is the opportunity to have that discussion and get context around what it is that I've planned in for that week. Hey, this is why it's here. This is why it is that way. It's awesome that you think it's a 6, but were you up to scratch if it was a 6? Or, geez, that's tough that you said it's a 9, but was it really a 9? And just having those discussions with the guys at such a critical point in time for anybody who's managing a program.
Absolutely. Orla.
Yeah, just something triggered in my mind when Dave was talking there. Like, I agree with everything he was saying, and similar with RPEs, I would much rather be the person collecting them to gain that insight on what the players are feeling. Back when I started, a few years ago, I hung my hat on acute chronic and collecting all that data, and this means this, we have to stop, etc. Whereas now I think it's best in our scenario anyway to use it just for a conversational tool. Use it to have that chat with the coaches and get them to understand, what does the training look like, what does it mean, what maybe could we adjust because of it. And similarly for the players, especially when you go down from professional ranks all the way down, and a coach, maybe a game hasn't gone so well, so we're blaming their fitness, so we now need to go train much harder for the next 2 weeks, but potentially they've already had a really hard 3-week block. And you can use that kind of acute chronic just to have the conversation around, well, this is currently what we're sitting at, what it looks like, and maybe let's plan better the next 2 weeks rather than just running them into the ground because of maybe something that has happened. So it just kind of helps start that conversation, as opposed to, well, we're sitting here, so they're all bound to get injured, because it doesn't have that prediction really value to it.
Yeah, absolutely, Orlaith. So, to put a light summary on there and to clarify one point, it sounds like, and again, we're repeating this, you start from the game, you work backwards from it. You create a plan. For some people, that plan might involve GPS, it might not, but you still have to get out there and build your plan. And then you have these tools, right? You have a tool called GPS. You have a tool called RP and duration that can start to give you a pulse check. Are they responding above, at, or below what we expect? And that, with conversation, ultimately should guide. And so I want to be very clear. Do we have dashboards for those watching and listening? Do we have acute chronic? Yes, we absolutely do. We're not saying we've abandoned ship there, but rather we don't overly depend on any one metric to tell the story, because ultimately it is far more holistic than that. And so if I can, I'd like to pivot here to Andy Whale. And again, Andy Whale has a very unique and important role within Irish Rugby from a data science perspective. So he ensures that the information we are collecting on players, that we're bringing in, it's valid, it's reliable, and that we are using it with the least amount of human error and bias possible. So Andy, maybe just from a statistics perspective, I know a lot of people watching are probably emerging sports scientists, even dabbling in data science. What's your position on the use of the word, prediction, and how should we be approaching this from a data perspective to make sure that we are as accurate as we can in our speech and in the way we're using this information?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly, first thing I'd say is I absolutely 100% agree with everything that Dave and Orla said there about, specifically on acute chronic ratio, it being used to start a conversation. And I think if I were to add anything, it would be I can't remember who said it. It was a physicist actually who used the expression, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And acute chronic ratio is a model for understanding potentially the relationship between workload and injury. And it's wrong. All models are wrong. If you try and reduce injury risk, particularly in a contact sport, if you try and summarize the risk a player has of getting injured to a number, or several numbers, maybe if it's across different metrics, whether it's RPE or GPS, you're going to miss something. And we all intuitively know how complex injury risk is. However, is it useful? And I think potentially, I think it certainly is. As has been mentioned before, it's not a question of saying, thou shalt not exceed acute chronic ratio 1.5. It's about, having that thing going on in the background, keeping an eye on it and saying, okay, what's our acute chronic ratio been? When it's been that way in the past, how have we performed? What's our injury risk looked like? It's not about, putting hard boundaries. It's just about having the information, keeping it in mind, and thinking about what the consequences have looked like when the data has looked like that in the past.
Yeah. And so what I hear there is we're trying to generate patterns. And so if you are going to collect data, make sure you collect it, whatever it is, often enough so that you can start to get an accurate pattern of how this person behaves and responds to certain things, and use those conversations to back up and brighten those patterns. Yeah. All the information we collect, Andy, and we're not saying we can predict anything. And so I think what you're doing is you're giving confidence, and you're giving, let's say, an important level of clarity on how we need to approach this. It's still an emerging area.
Absolutely. One of the big issues, of course, is how individualized and how personalized it needs to be. You know, if you've got a a young 20s athlete in their young 20s, you know, is there tolerance for either chronic load or acute load, or the relationship between the two? Is that going to differ from someone who's in their early to mid 30s? I would be very surprised if it didn't.
Yeah. Dave.
Yeah, I think Andy brings up a really good point in that as well, which is the ability to measure the response. So you have these load tracking variables, these things that you're seeing from your actual workload, but then what is the response of that? Tom spoke before about some really simple off-feet tests that could be used if you do have access to a bike. It could be something that simple to see what their autonomic nervous system response is. But I think, probably like he's just said, that the most available response variable is performance. And it could be something as simple as a conversation with your coach to say, hey, we've got this scale, like going back, it could be your prop scale again, but how would you rate this guy's performance this week? And look for those trends over time to see who responds really well to higher, lower, more consistent, more varied, whatever type of workload it is. And don't be too precious about the actual balance of it. Go searching for what's best for that person. But performance can be an incredibly sensitive and useful response variable. I think that's a really important point that Andy had there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dave. So let's now pivot to a topic that I know is going to dominate our listeners' minds, and that's around the pathway. So the vast majority of questions that we have are from individuals working in schools, working in clubs, trying to give players all the physical qualities they require to thrive and play this great game safely. So Charlie, question to you, as you look through the pathway in Leinster, are there any qualities that you feel are consistently being underdeveloped, but equally any qualities that are consistently, let's say, overdeveloped or overemphasized as players come up through the pathway?
I think the key word you said, Nick, was all the qualities. So it probably doesn't relate so much to the Leinster pathway anymore, but through other positions I've had, what tends to be over-resourced is strength. But I'm not saying we shouldn't do strength, but I think too often, which will be music to your ears, is movement in terms of how we using strength, because I've been guilty of it, and I've seen a lot of programs. You get a young prop who ticks all the boxes, can squat double body weight, bench 170, is the right weight, but can't scrummage. Yes, in the 4 strength sessions you have through the week, that prop is doing all 4. Would he not be better taking out one of the strength sessions and improving the skill or improving the movement? And I don't know how well we profile rugby players as opposed to athletes. Like, if someone ticks all the physical qualities but they can't move laterally, what are we doing to enhance that? Because it's a skill, as opposed to just being able to quantify and go, okay, well, all the numbers look really nice. I've done my job as the S&C. We haven't done your job as an integrated department with the rugby department in terms of improving the footballer. So, yes, I think we do need strength, but I think Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere are very different. Having come, and Dave, you'll probably back me up on this, in terms of Southern Hemisphere, the default will be speed, movement, skill, conditioning. When in doubt, having been at 2 Northern Hemisphere clubs, when in doubt, put them in gym and put some more size on them. And if you look at a young player's pathway, they start lifting from when they're 16. They're probably not going to be professional till they're 23. They're going to lift 3 times a week on average of 40 weeks a year. They're going to be strong enough. But are we missing a trick in terms of the other qualities that we've profiled that they need to get better at?
100%. Yeah, Tom, jump in there. Muted there, Tom.
Sorry, I took my hand down.
The joys of virtual roundtables.
Yeah, you should have put the sign up. Yeah, just looking at the points earlier by Dave and Charlie, just that integration with rugby coaches is really important. And that ties into what Dave was saying regarding preparing for contact and the movement, and Denis as well, they've got to be able to do the skills that are expected on the field. And typically when they do come through, maybe there's some of the aspects that really need more development. I don't find strength that hard to develop because you get plenty of opportunity within programs anyway. So if anything was to be slightly underdone, then I would prefer that as opposed to movement for definite for a developing player.
Yeah, we talk all the time around how do we make players faster, but then we find that we only have 1 to 2 15-minute windows that double as a warm-up a week. Yet, as we all say, we could be in the gym 3 to 4 times a week chasing strength. And so, especially early on, that ability to get a balance between strength. And Charlie, I love how you said it. How do we apply the strength, right? That's what movement is. How do we apply the strength? And that's the transfer. And so if I can just put my 2 cents in here as, well, young or not, but developing strength and conditioning coaches, right? We need to get out of the mindset of just developing ourselves in the gym. One of the biggest rate limiters I see is coaches being comfortable watching players move in real time, identifying a possible movement error, and then knowing how to step in with a cue or a constraint to make a difference. And if we become more comfortable with movement skill, and in this case, rugby movement skill, we are going to be able to get far more out of, let's say, the work we're doing in the weight room. And we might even start to observe that, hey, maybe I can cut back 20% and put some speed or movement skill work within our gym sessions, right? I mean, Charlie, if you don't mind sharing, when you first came to Leinster, you did something quite unique. You stopped calling them gym sessions or strength sessions, and you just called them athletic performance sessions. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and we changed that because as soon as you say gym, you think strength, whereas it's an opportunity to get someone better physically. And I go back to that example of the guy who's strong enough. Well, he can be in the gym, but let's work on improving athletic qualities. It's going to make him a better footballer as opposed to just the narrative of we're in the gym so we get strong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I think just to emphasise, maybe take pressure off young S&Cs as well. There's professional players and there's international professional players that still are trying to solve movement problems. So be that scrummaging, be that tackle entry, to some of the things that we've alluded to already on the call. This is not, the young S&C, here you go, all you got to do is focus on this and it's going to be your problem. This is something that we see continuously. Like lifestyle now is very much sat down. We're always trying to pull players out of these patterns, and we're also trying to get them to do these rugby actions with efficiency, more and more. So it's not just a development athlete. We've got professional players that are late 20s that are still working on these movement patterns and movement issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And Allan, if I can put you on the spot, is this maybe one of the reasons of many, but one of the reasons why sevens as a game, yes, in its own right, but also as a development tool, it's a game that requires you to move well. If you don't move well, you get exposed very quickly in sevens. And so for me, it seems like one of the reasons it's a great game for a young developing player and obviously an S&C coach to be aware of. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the nature of sevens being only 7 people on the same size pitch, you're going to be exposed to a lot more skill within the game, and you're going to be exposed to making your one-on-one tackle and being at the right height at your cleans and that sort of thing. So that's why for us in a sevens environment, that individual skill from a rugby perspective is always the most, has the most priority. So for us, the majority of our athletic performance development will be based from our sevens specific rugby training, as opposed to, as Charlie's saying, just getting them stuck into the gym.
Absolutely. So the take home is, you got to develop the engine, but we got to remember the engine's got to go in a car and they got to be able to drive that car. So let's holistically be developing the movement alongside it. Beautiful. Let's now pivot here to programming, and we'll start with Denis and then we'll go to Ed. So, key question we got from multiple people. What is the biggest difference between how you program in the preseason versus the in-season? Now, that's quite a broad question, so I'll let both of you kind of take it how you'd like. But Denis, let's start with you. What do you see as being the primary differences, even differences of emphasis, preseason versus in-season, when you look at your approach to programming?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I feel like if we're following a common theme that was kind of that's being said on the call here, it's this idea that there are these rigid boxes that we have. Acute to chronic means X. This means Y. Preseason means Z. So preseason is going to be our opportunity to develop our players. Lots of volume, lots of strength, because in season we're not going to be able to do that, right? So it appears that, like, in the conversation, there should be this clear difference between what you can do and what you're going to be limited to, because the preseason affords you the capability to do this and the in-season will not. I feel like that's a narrative that I've heard, and what that does is that restricts you to think, well, then the preseason is to develop hypertrophy and strength, and then in-season is going to be either, the maintenance of lean mass and the maintenance of strength, but we can't do these things, so your programming will reflect that. I'll be the first to say that is somewhat true and not entirely true. And what I mean by that is if I believe that the preseason is the only opportunity I have to develop these 2 or 3 qualities that my programming will focus on, because I won't be able to get in the in-season, that's a really limiting approach for me to have with players in a contact sport. So the short answer is, in terms of approach, there isn't a whole lot of difference. In terms of mindset, there isn't a whole lot of difference. It isn't, this is our only shot here for the next 6 weeks, so it's going to look like this. That's not the case. The key difference is the reality of the schedule allows for us to be more rigid in being able to stick to the program that we've written in the preseason. We know we've got so many days. There isn't going to be a match, so there isn't going to be much that will come in the way of affecting what we believe we planned. Whereas in season, we're a bit more adaptable in how we manipulate the levers on certain things, depending upon where we are in the season, depending upon a match that we've played or a string of games that may be coming up. But our mindset really is no different. And I know that's kind of a loose way of answering the question, but I do also want to be honest in that I don't bucket the season, I don't bucket the year into these distinct categories. And instead, it's, this is what we need, or this is what we want to be, and we can achieve that in any point during the year, but understanding we'll either dial up or dial down depending upon what we're facing. But we don't scrap whole scale a certain thing that we feel like we need to have in our program. So I think that.
So what it sounds like then, D, is it's a game of priorities. And at any given time, that priority gets dialed up, something else gets dialed down. But that's not to say that, hey, strength couldn't get dialed up at some point in the season, or even for certain players. And, I think that's a really interesting and important way that we don't have these kind of black box thinking that, okay, only in the preseason I can be developing someone. We talk all the time on these calls around development windows, and some vocabulary I've heard used from many of you is this difference between an exposure versus a stimulus. Whereas when it's an exposure, it's almost more of a maintenance mode, versus when it's a stimulus, I'm trying to get a little bit of adaptation, a little bit of development. But again, those words can flux based on your priorities.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's true. Like you touched on it, an exposure almost, the connotation is that you didn't plan on it. It happened to you. Whereas a stimulus is, I intentionally applied this to someone, right? And just like what you said there, and it's true, in season, it's like, how many exposures did you get versus how many did you plan on doing? And like you just said there, Nick, I think it's important for us as well. The mindset around, and not even the word development, but the creation of performance, it has to be year round, and we can't always be at the mercy of the schedule, because in where we are, that's a 10-month schedule, man. Like if for 10 months we're just trying to like defend ourselves and we only get 6 weeks to really attack, then that's a pretty poor place to be in if we really feel like we are affecting human performance, right? So that's one thing that we really try to do, and hopefully it's also reflected in our programming throughout the year.
So Ed, let's pivot to you now. You work in a slightly different environment. We have the men's and the women's sevens. You do a lot of the programming. Again, it's a different kind of season, but it is still a long season. And so how do you look at, parlaying off what Denis said, a preseason window versus an in-season, and how you approach your programming?
Yeah, there's differences, but there's similarities as well. I mean, I think pre-COVID we were looking, at Olympic qualifiers being in June, so I think we were looking at something like a 50-week season from week 1 all the way to hopefully what was going to be the Olympics. So there's a lot of planning that goes into that. But similar to what Denis said, it's not that one type of programming or one focus goes in pre-season and never comes back. We try and get things throughout the year where we need them. I think that the big difference is that pre-season is an opportunity to talk to the coaches, talk to the other S&C coaches, and see what we didn't have last year and maybe where we need to get better. And pre-season allows us to kind of put the roadmap out for that for the rest of the year. I think it's about maybe looking at what are the physical skills we need to execute, and then make sure that we have the capacities needed that we can get in the gym and start programming for them. So preseason just gives us a bit more chance to focus on them, and also probably put a little bit more volume through players. We can be okay with them being a little bit fatigued, knowing that preseason is generally well mapped out and we control a lot of it. Where once we get into in-season, it's very much focused on rugby. And we all love S&C, but we all work in rugby programs, and so the priority always is what happens on the field. So in-season is more a case of what can I get into these guys and girls, but make sure that they're still fresh and ready to go for rugby sessions. We're probably the biggest positive thing in sevens is that we don't have games week to week. So we tend to get, maybe a back-to-back tournament, and then we might have 3 or 4 weeks off from tournaments. So we can maybe get a little bit more load into them in those windows, and then have maybe 2 or 3 week periods where we're travel, where it's really a minimum dose. But as Denis said, it's not about one way of programming pre and post. It's more just about using the preseason to set us up for how we're going to program for the rest of the year.
100%. And one thing we've talked about in the past here is asking the following question. What does my game require, but is not developed by playing it? So what does the game of rugby, 7s or 15, require to be successful, but is not developed just by practicing and playing it? And I think that's a really important question for strength conditioning coaches to ask, to make sure that we're actually adding the value, adding the priorities, preseason or not, that we know will directly plug in to the performance of the player, but we know will not be developed just by practicing itself. And I think that's just a useful question to filter, again, the priorities that we need to be developing throughout a season. So really good. On a related note, still around programming, get into a bit more detail. Orla, let me go to you first on this. There was a specific question, and it's not the first time I've heard it. It's around this idea of, should we be training? Do we train, deceleration? I kind of hear two camps sometimes. Some camps say, well, gosh, too much deceleration, eccentric loading. Does it increase the risk? Do we get it enough in rugby? Do we have to train it? Others say, well, hold on. If deceleration is a high risk movement and we're not effective at that movement, should we not train it? So in your world, where do you see deceleration training fitting in?
Yeah, I think you've pretty much answered it as well. It depends on what's happening that week, depends on what's happening on the pitch as well. If I know on the pitch we're going to do a heap of sessions that have a lot of change of direction, have a lot of deceleration in it, I'm not going to add to that load too much in the gym and in some on-feet conditioning sessions. So it depends on the week and how much load they're getting through, but I definitely think it is a trainable area and something that does need to be included in programs. Specifically when we were talking about the contact prep earlier on and trying to get people in good positions, and Dave alluded to it with their footwork, being able to understand how to slow down, how to stop, how to change direction. They're going to need to understand how to decelerate and use their feet in that sense as well. So for us, I'll try and include it in a warm-up to kind of get the body thinking the right way before they go into a big hitter session. But similarly, in the gym, we can work on that with landing, jumps and lands, to be able to tolerate that load and to take that the eccentric load that you were talking about. So I think it is something that you don't want to forget about in your program, but do keep an eye that it does have impact on, that eccentric load patterns that they get during gym and field sessions. So not to overdo it as well.
Perfect. And I like what you say there. It's almost like, okay, you have to look at the load of the session. And so to the degree that you're doing loaded eccentric or loaded deceleration work, that has to come into balance, as we've been talking about with the training. But you also make note there that there's other things you can do that maybe don't have as much loading, but still can work on the patterns of flexion and the patterns of loading. And so there's that skill piece as well as that loading piece, and just how you get the balance right. I think that's absolutely critical, especially on the skill piece. And so Denis, obviously, you do quite a bit in the movement skill space, looking at contextual agility. What's your take on deceleration from both a loading and a movement skill perspective?
Yeah, I think you kind of led the way in what you got to ask yourself is what is the sport developing and what is it not developing, and then what do you notice based on the way certain things are executed within the sport predispose your players to doing a certain thing or not, right? So I would argue, and I don't know if I'm correct or not, that if we're looking at movement in space and decelerating, the nature of the sport of rugby probably does a pretty good job of doing that, right? If you look at the way a defense is going to react and then is going to get set to the line and things of that nature, they're probably going to have pretty good movement skill there. What I've noticed, both if I look at the way my players jump and then look at the sport of rugby, that's one where deceleration probably isn't as controlled, right? Like if we look at all of the elements of jumping that take place in a rugby match, outside of the line out where they're setting up for a maul and there might be a bit more control, when they land, they're not really landing with the idea of being controlled in their landing. And it's funny, if I watch my players jump in an environment outside of that as well, they do the same thing, right? Like we're creatures of habit and we'll adapt to what we're exposed to. And one thing that I see in rugby is that when it comes to jumping, they are not great at it. But when it comes to moving, they're pretty good at it, right? If they're setting up, an attack line, they're pretty good at that. So what we've focused on here specifically, letting the cat out the bag, is what holes do we need to fill, and what are we hopefully not just doing it for the sake of doing it, right? If you work on decel, then you must be doing it in a movement context. Well, in our case, maybe not as much, as I hate watching my guys do a counter movement jump, and when they land, they allow themselves to get destroyed by the ground. And it's just because that's what happens when they play. So like Orlaith said, we actually focus a lot more on landing mechanics. We focus a lot more on how our guys handle plyos and single leg landing mechanics and double leg landing mechanics when they jump, to fill in the gaps that the sport is not providing for them. We also focus on some upper body decel stuff, right? Our guys hit the ground a lot. So how we're doing landing mechanics, but from a push-up position for the upper body, a bit more explosive upper body movements that are going to deal with decel, and not just thinking that decel means, are we going to have them cut on a cone outside, and what that looks like. So we add a bit more context there.
So I think you summarized that nicely, in that if the game is giving you all the exposures you need from, let's say, a loading perspective, you might not need to chase the tissue loading. But if the way they're loading you observe is in a compromised movement, in this case, less of, let's say, open field, but more upon landing, that's where you have to say, hey, that's not just going to magically fix itself by doing more of it on pitch. We have to bring that into some kind of prep, or what we might call movement health, in our own work. And so I think that's spot on. It's great advice for people listening in. Let's keep with this theme then of movement skills. We'll shift now to Allan. And Allan, this is a tough one. I think this is a hot topic across sport, and kind of this idea of contextual versus decontextualized speed. And we've definitely had the conversation. So for you, when developing speed for rugby, whether it's 7s or 15s, how do you balance developing the decision making and the contextual speed, if you would, versus just your traditional speed training, getting out and just running straight ahead? So it's almost like speed as a physical quality versus the skill of speed from a decision making and a context perspective. When you look at us as strength coaches, where's our role in there? Is it both? Is it one? Is it the other? How do you balance them out?
Well, I think that's going back to that conversation we were talking about earlier around exposures and stimulus. First up, so for us in a sevens context, we're quite lucky and fortunate that we're able to have a close relationship with the coaches and the design of those training drills, so that we can get those contextual speed exposures from an acceleration and a decision-making perspective. So yes, we do try and manage those exposures through our rugby-specific training drills, because that's where we want them to be fast. We want them to have good game speed as opposed to just running fast in a straight line with no defense in front of them. So yes, we watch those exposures and work closely with the coach from an exposures point of view, but we do also focus a little bit on the stimulus side of things. So, almost an upskilling stimulus where we will look at a stimulus of acceleration or speed endurance once a week, depending on what our targets are for that week. But again, the key for us through these stimulus type sessions is that they can't affect the rugby for that week. So I don't want to now go and expose a sevens player to 2Ks of high speed running. And yes, I'm super stoked that they've all reached 95 max velocity, but then I'm telling the coach that, hang on, mate, no, you can't expose them to this exposure in a rugby session. So for me, again, it's managing those exposures through rugby drills. And again, yes, there are phases and times where we can look at increasing the stimulus, whether it's focusing on an acceleration session whereby we're trying to get the players to their max velocities in a shorter distance, or we've got a quality of we're focusing for the next few weeks on speed endurance from a sevens perspective. But again, I think we've all alluded to this now, is that can't take away from the rugby training specifically. That would be my key message around our speed training is, yeah, let's get it in if we can, and we can get those stimuluses in, but it can't take away from the contextual rugby training would be my thoughts.
100%. And so Dave, let me jump over to you then. You have, one 30-minute speed session a week. I'm not saying you do, but if you only had one 30-minute speed session a week, do you repeat the one-on-ones and the specific contextual speed work, or do you chase a stimulus and say, no, we're just going to try to upgrade the engine of speed, knowing that those contextual reps will take care of themselves in the rugby? How do you approach it?
Yeah, I think, we chase a stimulus. We chase an acceleration stimulus specifically. So if we got one session, we're going to prioritize the thing that's going to make the biggest difference to the game in our context in 15s, which is going to be your ability to win or at least cause problems in collision, and that's largely based around their ability to accelerate. So we use sleds. We then do some very minimal contextual acceleration work as a primer, and then let them unleash and see how fast they can run 10 meters. We're going to prioritize the acceleration, then we're going to approach our max speed as an exposure. So we'll see how much they get in the session. Again, we work on our budget, however many we've got left at the end of the week. We'll then let them run those out and see how fast they can get if they want to test themselves that way. But we're not trying to create more contextual circumstances, because when you get into the thick of rugby training, there's a hell of a lot of context, and these guys are incredibly competitive. So if there's ever a chance to run past someone, they're going to take it.
Yeah. Tom, jump in there.
Yeah, we try and keep a consistent exposure each week, but we maybe predict what we would get. Training follows a typical pattern, so we would kind of know based on based on past data. So we probably say, look, 50% of that exposure, we're going to keep that as a basic demand and make sure that everyone hits that every week. And we do that from one, it gives an opportunity to go after some technical aspects of coaching speed and mechanics, and probably the main priority is from a robustness measure around hamstring. We found that works really well for us regarding those injuries. And then the other 50% within that budget is what we're trying to achieve with rugby. Now, I'm always open-minded. If I can get 100% in rugby, I'm going after 100% in rugby. But the reality is that it just doesn't occur week to week as consistently, and I prefer that consistent exposure in week to week.
And again, I think I just want to emphasize the point. You're using the word exposure, but I also know, Tom, you'd have weeks where you might be able to chase a stimulus from a development perspective. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, maybe our language is slightly different, but yeah, I would say it's a stimulus. So we would look for a certain amount. Well, actually, no, the program's developed from an exposure. So let's say when we develop this system, we want an exposure at a certain percentage. So okay, look, we want you to get over 85%. That's an exposure. The stimulus now that we try and go after is sprint meters, so it's exposure above it, it's stimulus above 85%, for example. So positionally, you may need to get 10, 20, 30 meters at that for that stimulus, and we'll be pretty consistent with that. The main thing about developing that system is we've been very respectful for the amount of time it takes to get a player to be able to tolerate that without it knocking onto rugby, because absolutely we would not compromise the athlete's ability to do what he's there to do.
Yeah, no, 100%. And so let's now shift to our final question before we have a little bit of a lightning round. And I'm going to go to Orla and Ed on this one. And so if we look at the vast majority of strength and conditioning research, it's unquestionable the vast majority is on male subjects. And so we know now, obviously our sport, it's across genders. And so we're seeing more and more research start to come out. And so the question is, from a strength conditioning standpoint, are there any key differences in how we should be approaching developing strength and power across genders? Orla, obviously knowing you work with the women's 15s, Ed, you've worked with the women's 15s and across men and women's 7s. So Orla, I'll start with you. Are there any key differences strength conditioning coaches who work across genders need to be considering?
Yeah, and just like purely from my own experience, having worked with males and females in the past, I mean, if you look at them on a par to each other, oftentimes when you work with the female, they haven't got the same background in S&C exposures as males have. So that's obviously something that has to come into your mind when you start working with them, depending on what age they are. It's the same as when you start working with males as well.
Yeah.
The one thing that is out in the research, even though there's not a huge amount there, the one thing that it does say is that when you apply the strength stimulus, they have the ability to develop strength relative to what they're lifting to their body weight in the same way that men can. Obviously, it happens a little bit differently depending on the hormonal balance, but essentially females can develop strength relative in the same way that males can. So I think that's a positive aspect of
absolutely
being a strength coach. The one difference then that comes into play is their body composition and their body makeup, and how their movement patterns might be slightly different to how a male might move. And a lot of I've just experienced with some females, they tend to back and hip issues tend to come into it a lot more than what I've seen in males. So it's just something for us to be aware of in our group when I'm, writing programs for them. And the other thing, and it's a hot topic at the moment, but again, there's not enough research in it, is the hormonal makeup of females is so different to males. So you've got the menstrual cycle, you've got all these different hormones that they have in their body that males don't. There just isn't enough research out there to tell us what's happening, what it's doing. There's a general idea. And we know that if a female is going through a normal menstrual cycle, it's possibly having an effect on how they recover and adapt to a strength stimulus, or how they recover and adapt to an aerobic stimulus, depending on the time of their month, depending on the time of the cycle. There's not enough data to hang your hat on it yet, but even I've seen with the girls, we've been collecting that data for a while now, and they all have different patterns. You definitely can't do one size fits all. So some girls will react differently in weeks 1 and 2 versus how they might react in weeks 3 and 4. And it's not to say that they have to do this in week 1, week 2, this then in week 3 and week 4, but to just understand individually how they all cope with those different stimuluses based on where they are in their menstrual cycle. So what I might do with a girl in week 1 and 2 might be different in week 3 and 4 for athlete A, but it's also very different then for athlete B. So I think them tracking, collecting that data and understanding their bodies helps them as well. So to put it simply, you can still develop strength, you can still develop them as athletes, they'll react the same way, but there's just a few more variables at play that you have to be aware of.
Brilliantly said, Orla, brilliantly said. And I think the one thing you got to treat everyone as an individual. That's number one. And there's a key emerging science that as strength conditioning coaches, if you're working across genders, you can't ignore. And we need to continue to upskill ourselves in, and be comfortable engaging in those conversations, because ultimately it's in service of the player is exactly what I'm hearing from you.
And just to put it simply, for anybody who is working with females, if they don't understand the menstrual cycle, what they're saying is the first 2 weeks of it, strength stimulus and being able to react to strength training is really good. And in the second 2 weeks of it, the ability to adapt to strength training is a little bit less. just because of the way the hormones fluctuate. So generally what I'm trying to educate the girls around is just tracking how that's looking now. And if you feel great and we can push hard in those first 2 weeks of your cycle, great. And if not, in the second 2 weeks, not to get bogged down if the scores aren't as big, or if you're not able to push the same weight, and not thinking that, oh, I've, disimproved. It's just more so this is how your body's reacting. And just to be aware of it, really.
100%. Very comprehensive. Thank you, Orla. Ed, anything to add there in your experience?
Not a huge amount. I think, as Orla said, the big difference is that training age usually isn't there. And unfortunately, the structures that the girls come through, there's no definitive pathway at the minute for them. So you can get female players coming to a high level of rugby, but with a low training age in terms of strength or really structured kind of athletic performance work. So it's important really to make sure that those robust kind of foundational work that work is put in place for them. A lot of focus on building general capacity, strength, creating tension, and being forceful in their movements. And then just to follow on from what Orla said, being a male coach working with female athletes, it's very important to have that open conversation with them, so that they can be comfortable coming to you with any issues around that, especially any kind of menstrual cycle issues, that if they feel really good coming into a session or really bad coming into a session, that they can be confident to come to you and say that. And it's just regular conversation. It's part of it. You say, yeah, okay. If you feel really good and you want to
I'm going to put 2 questions to you. Let's try to keep our answers under a minute here. And so the 2 questions are as follows. 1, what advice would you give, let's say, to your undergraduate self? You just going into S&C or sports science, what advice would you look back and give yourself? And then taking it forward, what advice do you have for strength conditioning coaches who are applying for roles within Irish Rugby or abroad? And so what should they be looking to develop in themselves? What are you looking for when you bring on a new strength conditioning coach? And so Dave, we'll start with you. What advice would you give to yourself? And then what advice would you give to those aspiring strength coaches?
Read the methods section. That'd be like my primary bit of advice to my undergraduate self. Like if you want to do well in sports science in school, or if you want to do well in applied sports science, read the methods section. Don't worry about the conclusions. Don't worry about the practical applications. Read the methods so you can understand how it was done, what they're saying to you, because you'll find a lot of ridiculous conclusions. In terms of what advice would I give to someone entering the marketplace right now, experience is really important, but the entry point is to be hardworking, to be reliable, and to be a great communicator and a connector. If you're not the 3 of those, I don't care how smart you are. It doesn't matter to me. You could have all the experience in the world. If you don't know how to talk to someone, or if you're not hardworking, or if I can't rely on you to do something, you're an intern. So be those 3 things first, and then gain your experience as you go. If you're applying for jobs, be patient, apply for lots, learn from those processes, and do as much as you can.
Thank you, Dave. Orla.
Yeah, undergraduate self, I think, like when I graduated, I think I panicked a little that I didn't know enough. So I think it's being aware that there's plenty to learn, and you will in the field, and there's so many people out there to learn off. So even if it's a case that you're about to graduate, you potentially don't have opportunities coming up. Knock on people's doors, ask the questions, learn from as much as you can, shadow as much as you can. And like Dave said, like, I think communication is key. So being able to have those conversations with more experienced people to learn, and just open yourself up to opportunities.
Awesome. And in terms of people coming in, anything to build on there?
Coming in, yeah, I think it's like that. It's, if you're a young S&C coach, it's just being open. Understanding you don't know everything, but being willing to take it on, make the mistakes, and learn from it.
Yeah, and recognizing that, if you are applying for a role, there is no expectation that you know it all. But as Dave said, there is an expectation that you are open, Orla, as you said, you're hungry, and you're at least going to pursue improving yourself and improving your communication.
Yeah, and that's it. It's not selling yourself that you're ready for the job, but selling yourself that you can apply yourself in it and learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Allan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already been said. Advice to undergraduate self is probably just to talk to more people in various aspects of sports, whether it be rugby to tennis to soccer, just to get as many bits of advice and words of wisdom from people that have been there and done that. There's so many people out there that are so willing to talk and share. So I think that's probably the biggest part of advice. You learn a lot in your undergraduate, but just talk to, people in this group, the Charlies, Daves and Denises, to learn as much as we can from that. And then, again, applying for roles, realize that you're probably not going to come in and, be a massive, huge difference. You've got to come in there and slowly change, see what's needed, and just slowly buy into what's happening. It's a difficult one, applying for roles at the moment, but again, you just need to come in with patience, I think, and see what's needed.
Absolutely. Ed?
Yeah, I think looking at, talking to your undergraduate self would be, as we said already, it's an ever ongoing process of learning and getting better. So it's not about knowing everything now. It's just about, how can I slowly improve myself and get better, and then look back over 6, 12, 18 months or more and go, wow, I've improved in this area and this area, and know that that's still not going to be the finished product, that it's always ongoing. And then really to undergraduates who are out there now and maybe applying for jobs, I would say, it is a saturated market and it is quite a tough place, but don't underestimate the value you're going to get from coaching your local rugby club or your local GA club or just working with, an underage team. They're all opportunities to get better as a coach, and they're all opportunities to learn, and you'll take a lot from those environments and bring them up into high performance environments when you get there.
I think many a great coach would cite those early experiences as being the most formative and oftentimes the most challenging. You have no resources, but ultimately it's the experience you gain from that will allow you to achieve that dream. And that's just not bumper sticker words. That's the reality. I know everyone on this call has had to push and has had this call, is I know you never thought you were too big for them. If anything, you pursued them, as you say there, Ed. So 100% great advice. Denis?
Yeah, if I could go back, and again, a lot of it has already been said on the call, so there's a lot of alignment here. But I think I would tell my undergraduate self to try everything. A lot of like what Allan said, and to take it a step further, not have the conversations with everybody, but actually try everything, right? Like actually be exposed and know what it feels like to be outside of your comfort zone in a sport. I think my undergraduate self thought that I knew too quickly what sport I wanted to be in and what area I wanted to go in, and narrowed myself there. I wish I had done more Olympic weightlifting competitions and learned what it was really like to prepare for that kind of a competition, or things of that nature. So I think I would tell my undergraduate self to not only talk to people outside in every single sport, but then actually give it a crack, because anybody can compete in anything. There's a lot out there. You don't have to be a pro to compete. And so I think that side I wish I would have done more of, and I tell my undergraduate self to give it a shot. I wasn't really doing that much on a weekend where I couldn't do that competition. To people applying, again, I'm going to piggyback on what everybody has said here, and I like Dave using the word connected, the connector. A lot of places I know have a lot of really intelligent people. I don't think organizations, clubs, and teams lack intelligent people, but they do lack glue. If you can be the glue to a place, that is probably way more valuable than being the person that everybody perceives as the genius. And it's actually the person that is the glue that is the genius, because that's what makes it work. So while I think that a lot of people are worried about their CVs and who they know and who they've spoken to, communication is one thing, and I think that you got to be a great communicator. But if you can be the glue in a place, if you can be the one that holds that place together, that's something that's priceless. So think about how you can be the glue, I think is what I would tell somebody that's trying to get out there now.
So someone said this to me the other day, like, everyone knows how important the glue is, or everyone knows how important the mortar is, the connection. Yet when they look at professional development, why do we go and continue to buy more bricks? We're out there buying more of the what, more of the methodology, more of the X's and O's, but are we actually pursuing the exposures, the education, the conversations that give us the mortar, that give us the glue, that give us the capacity to know how to connect by choice, not chance? 100% D. Tom?
Yeah, undergraduate self, take your time. It's going to take a long time to develop to get to the levels that you want to be. That's not a fast process, so just be prepared to be in for the long haul. But that's exciting as well. You've got more time than you think, so get experience in S&C in sports science, but don't disvalue what you can get in other lines of work that will enhance how you work with people in this industry. So, you know, I know Charlie would be a fan, but, you know, if you're in sales, knowing how to sell is very important when you're dealing with players. And if you're a good salesman, you're probably going to be a good S&C. In terms of people applying for strength and conditioning roles, tell me how you've done things. Yes. I definitely do never expect a finished article, nor probably 9 times out of 10 want to employ a finished article. So I'm not looking for someone who wants to demonstrate that they've done everything. I want to know how you've done what you have done, and know yourself as a person, because if you know where your weaknesses are, then I think that vulnerability is a good thing to get across. I think people are too quick to try and think that they can solve everything when, you know, I think we know in this role that we definitely can't. So just have a good self-awareness.
Yeah. Demonstrate what you will do by sharing what you have done. Give us concrete examples that illustrate how you are as a person. 100%, could not agree more, Tom. Charlie?
To the undergraduates, get your hands dirty. Too often, if you want to be in the right pile, the opportunity pile, seeing CVs where you've just finished or you're studying and you haven't got your hands dirty, you haven't coached, is probably not going to get you over the line. There should be no reason why you're studying. Do some volunteer work. I think everyone's alluded to that. Become a better coach. Put into practice what you're learning at uni. For the young, up-and-coming S&C, get a mentor. Okay, if I look back at my career, could have probably got to where I am a lot quicker. I've made a lot less mistakes if I had someone telling me what to do and what not to do. And as you know, Dave alluded to, network, because quite often the best person doesn't get the job. The best fit gets the job. So you need to know what jobs are out there, what's happening in the industry, because quite often, unfortunately, when jobs are advertised, sometimes they've already got someone in mind. So you need to have your finger on the pulse, and you need to have yourself in the shop window.
Love it. And Andy, there is no doubt you are going to be part of a pioneering group of people who are going to start becoming what we might call, you know, sport data scientists. And so what's the advice to the younger self? But really, if you could kind of paint a future, what do you see as being the core skills that are going to be needed to do the kind of work that you do, which is more than just understanding GPS in an Excel file? And that's not meant to be flippant or belittling, but the reality is you've taken it much farther than that. So advice to your young self, and what do you think is the key steps for people that want to get into kind of this sport data science role?
I think in terms of advice to my undergraduate self, I mean, it's been mentioned by Denis and Tom in particular, about, you know, not not limiting yourself just to what you're studying. Don't be afraid to try everything. And whether that's extra modules or whatever it is. But if I think the skills I'm using on a day-to-day basis in this role, 90% of them were never taught to me in a classroom or in a lecture theatre or anything like that. It's stuff I've picked up as I've gone through, and that's been going through in non-sport roles as well as sport-related roles, which I think sort of leads on to that second question about the skills you need. And I mean, I think the biggest one, and I don't mean it to sound so nebulous, but the biggest one I think is learning how to learn stuff. It's learning how, this is where we are at the moment, this is where we want to get to. At the moment, I don't know how to do that, but it's about learning how to find out how to do that stuff. And that's where, the vast majority of the skills I'm using at the moment, whether that's coding, whether that's analysis, it's those things for the main haven't been taught to me. What was taught to me was how to find out those things. And I've then gone on and taught myself.
Awesome. Well, I know each one of you know this from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate all of you sharing your insights today. And I want to thank everyone, even though this is recorded, who is watching this and learning from these amazing people. And what I hope more than anything else we've demonstrated here is the value of community, that we only have one voice, we only have one mind, but when we start to bring it in with other people, something can happen beyond both of us. And that's what we're trying to do with this group. And so hopefully by you getting to step in to our world from an AP leadership perspective, you've not only taken things away from an answer perspective, but also taking things away from a philosophy of how we approach, as Andy said there beautifully, getting better at getting better. So thank you and be safe.